Hi, everyone. We're going to have a lecture today on existentialism. And this is going to be from chapter 6 in the book The Universe Next Door by James Sire, chapter 6. Make sure you have the lecture notes printed out and you're ready to go, and we'll get going here. So, what is existentialism? Sire, I think, helpfully says that in existentialism, you have this desire to transcend the nihilism that's entailed by naturalism. I hope you see the progression in the book now. He kind of talks about, in Western thought, this development of Christian theism and how through deism that kind of morphs into naturalism, which pushes its devotees, its faithful, so to speak, into nihilism. And existentialism is this desire to kind of get back out into a world with some kind of meaning. It's a desire to transcend. And Sire talks about two forms of nihilism. One is atheistic and one is theistic. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. And you'll see this throughout this discussion where they are very different. There's different conclusions from atheistic and theistic existentialism. There's a lot to be said for theistic existentialism. There's a lot of good that movement has brought about. There's some big problems, but in general, I mean, theistic existentialism can be very helpful, and so it's very different from atheistic existentialism in a number of ways. And yet, there are some similarities too. So, Sire, for better or for worse, includes them in the same chapter. But with atheistic existentialism, the desire is to transcend the nihilism entailed by naturalism. But with theistic existentialism, there's this desire not to transcend the nihilism that's a result of naturalism per se, but more of a desire to transcend poor versions of theism, and all the while taking these modern themes that come through nihilism seriously. So you see this in the writing of Kierkegaard. Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish existentialist, he was really concerned with kind of this dead and lifeless orthodoxy, so to speak, that he saw in the Danish Lutheran Church. And so the desire in his version of existentialism is to kind of get beyond that into a truer form of life with God and life in community, life as a self. But they both take these themes from nihilism very seriously. Now, let's talk about kind of the history here, and then we'll go into atheistic existentialism first. Something to keep in mind is that the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, he really does kind of presage both nihilism and atheistic existentialism. He has this idea that you have a world that's sort of valueless and is godless. That is, that God is dead in terms of people's understanding of him. God is not really, has never existed. And so what's left? Well, for Nietzsche, he claims that there's this kind of internal desire, this will, that could lead somebody to overcome the meaningless entailed by the death of God. This is the will to power. That through kind of being a true self, I can overcome this meaningless that's entailed by this death of God and the whole value system that sits around theism, especially Christian theism for Nietzsche, but also Jewish theism as well, I think Nietzsche had in mind. And so there was this desire to kind of find something meaningful that the self could live for. And it was in the will, and that was something that we could actually put our hands on, is that I have a will, and therefore through my will, I can overcome this world. So this idea of overcoming, this Übermensch, which sometimes is translated Superman, was really more of like an overman, the overcomer, the person who overcomes. So that's part of the historical background here. Part of the historical background, too, is, like I just mentioned, the cold religion of many in Europe. And this is exactly what Kierkegaard is responding to in Denmark, is that many Danish Lutherans were kind of going through the motions in their religious practice, and Kierkegaard was offended by this. And so you might even see some similar themes in how you look at your relationship with God, in that sometimes it's easy for those of us who are dedicating our lives into Christian service. we can look at the religion of people around us and say, well, that's not really Christianity. I don't want any version of that. I want a dynamic relationship with God. And I think Pentecostalism in particular has kind of latched onto this, but evangelicalism in many ways in general as well. So that's part of the history here, is that there was sort of this identification by theistic existentialists that we don't want just this cold religion. We want something that's real. I think the First World War is a key demarcation point, though, in the development of existentialism. So the First World War, you see kind of the collapse of the myth of progress. This idea that the world is kind of getting better and better all the time. This international system can ensure peace. And the international system to ensure peace was kind of set up after the Napoleonic Wars to bring stability into the Western world. And what that ended up leading to was kind of like a cold conflict of countries building alliances. And this alliance system breaks down, and you have just massive casualties in Eastern and in Western Europe, millions dead, an entire generation of young men really wiped out, and not wiped out completely, of course, but just their youth taken from them, their innocence taken from them. And how do we look at the world as being meaningful and good? How do we think that things could possibly be getting better in a world where millions of young men die in the trenches? Millions of young men used as kind of human shields and used as just to be mowed down by the enemy in sustained armed conflict. And so you see this with especially with Sartre and Camus in France. You might read their names as Sartre and Camus. It's Sartre and Camus in France, where they look at the kind of the death of the French generation that they were a part of. They're thinking, how could we find any meaning in a world where this happens? Of course, this is exacerbated by the Second World War. The Great Depression as well. You see this where the economic system was kind of let people down, and all of a sudden you have millions of people displaced, especially in North America and the Dust Bowl, and you have just this massive economic chaos for years and years. You see the problem of human dignity with the rise of National Socialism, the Nazi Party in Germany, where what does it mean to look at humans as having any kind of lasting value when strength and military might can wipe out 6 million Jews by through a systematic murder by a terrible regime. So that you can see there's issues with how people could perceive the world as being meaningful in this kind of state. And I think existentialism is kind of a common view today. People in our culture, they're desiring some kind of meaning. And yet the picture of meaning that's given to them by secular humanism, which is, of course, kind of the reigning worldview inside our schools and our institutions of higher learning around this country, is that humans are special somehow, but not really, because when you look at the world around us, we're the result of these this evolutionary process. Every culture is different, every human's different. We talk about human rights, but we don't want to talk about the God who guarantees those rights or with whom those rights originate. And so people are trying to live in this world of global capitalism, of globalization, with irreligiousness, with cynicism, and they're trying to find some kind of meaning. They're trying to start with, well, what makes me tick? What makes me happy? What kind of helps me to be the best person I can be? That's an existentialist move, to kind of go back to the self. So many people in our culture, while not probably very philosophical in their existentialism, are attempting to make some kind of leap out of the meaningless that's entailed by modern life. I mean, think about this now. I mean, just with the coronavirus crisis that we're living through right now, we look at this world of global capital, and the economy is supposed to boost up everybody's life, and the economy was growing wonderfully before this happened. But 10 years of economic growth wiped out in a month, especially with respect to Wall Street. There's the gains in the markets have been wiped out in a month. And so somebody who's thinking, I want to make a lot of money so I can do what I really want, or I can make a lot of money so I can retire. Maybe they've lost their job at this point. How do you find meaning in a world like that? Well, without a transcendent source, it's difficult, and this is why we do what we do. This is why we're trying to learn how to proclaim the lordship of Jesus Christ over all of reality, and how there's hope for this life and beyond this life for all. Well, let's talk about atheistic existentialism. I'll keep moving here. With atheistic existentialism, there's basic agreement with naturalism on some key issues: the nature of reality, what happens at death, with the theory of knowledge, with ethics, and with history. There's basic agreement. Again, it's atheistic existentialism. The atheistic existentialists, they're not trying to go back and deny the developments of the naturalistic worldview, especially with respect to Darwinian theories of origins, to this this idea that God is no longer necessary for us to kind of cognitize and understand the world. There's essential agreement there, but there are some little differences. With the nature of the cosmos, this is worldview question 2. The cosmos, for atheistic existentialists, is of course solely composed of matter, per naturalism, but human beings kind of experience the cosmos in a couple of different ways. That is, reality appears to us in a couple of different ways. And this is something that's key for existentialism, is the self. Myself as a knower, as an experiencer, as a self, as a being in the universe. This is where all of my analysis really begins. And so there's these two forms of reality. There's the subjective and the objective. The objective world is, of course, the world of science and logic, and none of this is denied. It's a thoroughly mechanistic, naturalistic world, and that reinforces the absurdity of life. No existentialist wants to say that nihilism has nothing important for us to understand. They get that we live in an absurd universe. Naturalism entails absurdity. But there's this secondary way of looking at reality, and that's the subjective world. This is the world of the self, of the mind and consciousness. In this world, humans have some kind of freedom. And it's not that it's objective freedom. Of course, there's no such thing as objective freedom, because I'm merely the result of cause and effect, biology and chemistry, chance and necessity, plus nothing in a closed system. But as a self, as somebody who's experiencing the world, as a subject in this subjective world, science and logic are not a part of this. Science and logic have their own domain in the objective world, but in my own kind of personal world, I have some kind of freedom and will. Now, this means that there's a kind of disunity with respect to the cosmos. Science tells us that life has no meaning, but the subjective world disagrees, because as a subject, of course I think that my life has meaning. It has meaning to me. But there's no attempt to reconcile the objective world with the subjective world. These are different domains. They're non-overlapping. You don't try to understand one by virtue of the other. They are separate worlds. I live in my universe as a subject, and of course the naturalistic world is what it is. And existentialist thought is designed in such a way for me to live as a subject, as a self, despite the absurdity in the world around me. With worldview question number 3, what is the nature of a human being? Of course, in this objective way of understanding things, humans, of course, are just complex machines. Our personalities are the result of an interrelation of chemical and physical properties that we don't really fully understand. But for human beings, as a subject, as subjects, as individual selves, in terms of how we experience the world, remember, the objective world's out there. We're not denying that. But as somebody who experiences the world, for these people, existence precedes essence. People make themselves who they are. Existence precedes essence. Let me explain that really quickly. Essence has to do with what kind of thing you are. Are you a square? Are you a dog? Are you a human? Are you matter? Are you soul? For an existentialist, your existence precedes your essence. That is, you show up on the world and you find out that you just are, you exist. And then you determine who you want to be. Existence precedes essence. This is from Jean-Paul Sartre. This is his way of describing these things. And this is on page 121 in your book, about 2/3 of the way down the page. If God does not exist, there is at least one being in whom existence precedes essence, a being who exists before he can be defined by any concept. And this being is man. First of all, man exists, turns up, appears on the scene, and only afterward defines himself. So we live in this absurd world, but you can define who you are, according to existentialism. I hope you can see at some point here that if God really didn't exist, this is actually a very attractive way of thinking about things. If there is no such thing as God, existentialism offers some kind of cognitive framework for you to think, yes, but still I'm going to live the way I want to live, and I'm going to live a meaningful life. So according to Sartre here, what he's saying is that there's not some divine design that's been placed on you. He denies, of course, the image of God in us, right? He's no Christian. He denies the image of God, but what he's saying is that you define who you are. There's no overarching design coming down upon you. There's the actions and the freedom that you exert, and that defines who you are, not some pre-existing design. To continue with worldview question number 3, the nature of a human being. Each person is totally free as regards his or her nature or destiny. This is a problem because when you're talking about human nature and human destiny, according to naturalism, your human nature is really just that you're a material being that's part of the same tree of life as all other biology. And in terms of your destiny, history's not going anywhere. It has no direction. It's teleologically directionless. But of course, if you live in this subjective world, then you just live freely. And you determine who you are. You decide what your nature is, and you decide where you're going. You make your own goals. And there's no attempt made to reconcile this objective and this subjective world and try to make them fit better together. There are logical problems here. But existentialism does not try to resolve the logical difficulty. In fact, it sort of doubles down on the logical difficulty and says, yeah, that's just how it is. This is on page 122 in your book. And this is the quote by John Platt, referring to B.F. Skinner's naturalistic behaviorism. He says, the objective world, remember objective, subjective, the world of isolated and controlled experiments is the world of physics. The subjective world, the world of knowledge, values, decisions, and acts, of purposes which these experiments are in fact designed to serve, is the world of cybernetics, our own goal-seeking behavior. Determinism, that is, that you have no free will, or indeterminism, lies on that side of the boundary, while the usual idea of free will lies on this side of the boundary, that is the subjective side. They belong to different universes, and no statement about one has any bearing on the other. You can see there's even kind of an overarching logical issue there, because he's saying that he's making these kind of definitive and categorical statements over both universes. So he's claiming to have a universal view above the universes of objective and subjective. Do you see that's a problem? That's a logical issue. I hope you can see that. Now let's keep going. Worldview questions number 2, 3, and 4. The highly wrought and tightly organized objective world stands over against human beings and appears absurd, right? So this world, this kind of objective world, it appears to be absurd. Our everyday experiences have no purpose. I mean, think about that when if you've come off of the trenches in World War I, you think, what is this all for? There's no purpose to this. But there seems to be freedom to make ourselves. But the world appears to us to be absurd. Now, death reminds us also that our subjective world has no ultimacy. Therefore, even the self is absurd. And so, existentialism understands that the nature of the cosmos, the nature of human being, and the nature of what happens at death is such that you're kind of confronted as a self. You show up on the scene in this absurd universe where death is certainly coming your way, whether it's through a war, through a genocide, through a plague. Remember the influenza plague happened in 1918, and many people across the world died this way. And this appears all absurd. Death is coming. So even as a self, to come into the world and try to define oneself and to live freely and to have goals, that appears to be absurd. And existentialists don't try to deny this. They think that the world is absurd. And yet they still try to live with this tension of trying to say, I'm still going to try to live with some kind of meaning that I make. I define what is meaningful. With worldview question number 5, this is with respect to ethics. In full recognition of and against the absurdity of the objective world, the authentic person must revolt and create value. So you recognize that the world is absurd, and you're just going to push back against it. Say, I'm not going to live as if that's true. I'm not going to do this. There's a lot of personal will that goes into being an existentialist. What can I do? I can act. And when I act, that makes something good. Action determines what the good is. Action determines my destiny, my purpose. The conscious choice is the right one. The people who just kind of roll along in society and they let the genocides happen, they let the world wars happen, they live as if money is all that matters. These people have it wrong. The person who acts, the person who takes control of destiny and defines themselves, this person is living rightly, according to existentialism. Now, there's some big problems here, huge problems. I mean, and I hope you can see them, because all of this is begged by the question of but if it's all absurd, then it is actually still absurd, your subjectivity notwithstanding. And this is exactly what Sire tries to point out here. He says that subjectivity leads to solipsism. This is the idea that you as an individual, if you're living as if you are kind of defining your destiny, then you're the only person who can determine values. You're living as if you're the only judge in the universe. You're living as if you're the only meaningful judge and lawmaker in the universe. So there are different individuals, though, and existentialists don't deny this. But what this means is that I as a self am the ultimate meaning maker. But of course, there's other people that for them, they are the ultimate meaning makers. See, this is the problem. Existentialists want to affirm something objective, and it's that all actions determine the value for all people. But the problem is that according to existentialism, there is no external moral referent. That would be God. There's no such thing as an external moral referent, somebody where you can say, this is the one who determines value. So when I say action determines what's valuable, how do I know that that's not just applicable to me? See, this becomes solipsism, this idea that you're the only thing that exists that's meaningful. There's no external reference, so there's no common ground for the common good. I hope you can see this. On existentialism, there is no common ground for the common good, because God is dead, according to atheistic existentialism. Now, another problem that Sire points out is that if choosing is what makes the action good, remember action, if making that choice makes the action good, then is anything really good? Well, you know what would be wrong. What would be wrong in this world, if choosing is what makes an action good, then non-action would be evil in this schema, right? Non-action is bad. However, this is a problem because none of this can affirm our innate sense of right and wrong. What existentialists want to do is they want to affirm that humans believe in right and wrong, and that belief in right and wrong is meaningful. We don't want world wars. We do want generosity. Existentialists, again, are very nice people, right? They're trying to be good people. Sire points this out with respect to the book The Plague by Albert Camus. The only reason that there can be heroes in the book The Plague is that existentialism is parasitic on these innate Christian ethics that people have in them in the West. This kind of innate sense of trying to alleviate suffering is a good thing, and trying to steal from other people is a bad thing. See, in the case of the person who's a thief and the person who's a doctor, they're both acting And yet, how do you affirm that one is good and the other is bad? Well, you have to have some kind of ethics for this. That's a big problem for existentialism. Finally, with respect to atheistic existentialism, worldview question number 8, the core commitment of every full-blown atheistic existentialist is to himself or herself. I am going to determine my reality, and I'm going to make something meaningful of my life. You can see why this is something that a lot of people in the West have kind of held on to, is they see that there's some meaning in, as a self, just making something happen in the world that's good for me. Let's talk about theistic existentialism. There's some problems with this part of the chapter in Sire's book because it's just incredibly overly simplistic. He talks about the theological movement of neo-orthodoxy. By that, he's talking about people like Barth, Brunner, Niebuhr, Bultmann. And when you study these theologians, their theologies are very different in some places. Neo-orthodoxy is a very wide range of theologies. However, this is a simple treatment. It's a worldview handbook. It's an introduction. Hopefully, you'll be able to study these things more in depth on your own. I don't recommend neo-orthodoxy as this is a good place to nail down your foundation as a theologian. But it is very fascinating, and it's very important in terms of theological reflection, especially in the 20th century. I hope that you'll give it a more full treatment in your own development, and I'd be happy to recommend some resources on that. For now, though, just know that this is kind of a simplistic treatment, and that's okay. It's a textbook. That's what it will do. But let's talk about this kind of theistic existentialism. Why did this develop? Well, we already talked about the dead orthodoxy that you see in the Danish Lutheran Church. This is where Kierkegaard is coming from. But this is kind of true all over the West, that there's sort of dead orthodoxy in a lot of churches, especially in the late 19th century, early 20th century. People are noticing that a lot of Christians are just going through the motions. This is theological nihilism. We talk about God, but we don't actually live as if God's real. We just sort of go through the motions. And there's also theological liberalism as a movement at this time. Through the rise of textual criticism, which we absolutely use at Life Pacific. We don't deny the insights of textual criticism at all, but in kind of the first emergence of textual criticism, it basically was used as a way to undercut traditional doctrines and traditional orthodoxy. That is, of course, we don't have any proof that Jesus actually existed. These kinds of things were coming up. When people would start to look at the Bible, they would say, well, I mean, these are stories of miracles, and we all know miracles don't happen. That's what happened in kind of the early kind of textual criticism of the Bible. Of course, I'm simplifying that as well, but you get the idea. The deity of Jesus, the truth of the Bible, all of these are undercut by theological liberalism. Liberalism essentially denies the supremacy of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ is the only way to God, that Jesus Christ is in fact God, and of course denies the truth of the Bible. But what else causes this? Well, I think the turbulence of early 20th century European politics. I think people are still looking at the world around them and saying this world is falling apart. So how can we still be selves before God? How can we still acknowledge God in this kind of crazy world? So neo-orthodoxy. Neo-orthodoxy has basic acceptance of Christian theism's worldview questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 8. All right, the basic theistic issues. Neo-orthodoxy isn't like drastically setting itself apart from those things. But there are some key differences. Some big issues in neo-orthodoxy, which I find to be incredibly unhelpful for theological reflection, and I think Sire would agree. And these are things that we should know about. With respect to worldview questions 3 and 5, human beings are personal beings who, when they come to full consciousness, find themselves in an alien universe. Now, whether or not God exists in this universe is a tough question to be solved not by reason, but by faith. So you see this big bifurcation between reason and faith that had always been an issue, and Christians have always dealt with this. There's always been reflection on the nature and the interrelationship between reason and faith. But in neo-orthodoxy, you see kind of like a very big stake smashed into the ground that separates these two things. They're different areas. Reason and faith are different things. Again, I'm simplifying, but hopefully this is helpful. We have knowledge of our own existence. We know that we're here in this universe, but knowledge of God's existence and nature are not really direct items of our subjective experience. We don't have kind of direct knowledge of God in this world. We don't have evidence of him. Neo-Orthodoxy tends to deny natural theology, the idea that something about God can be known in the world around us, that we have objective knowledge about the existence of God. It denies certain views of the doctrines of Revelation, which, not the book of Revelation, but this idea that God has spoken, and God has spoken in this definitive way. Neo-Orthodoxy tends to deny that. So what we have that left then in this response to the seemingly meaningless universe is a leap of faith. And you see this in the writings of Kierkegaard in particular. That we just go against the evidence or in spite of the evidence, and we say, all right, I'm going to believe and I'm going to be a person of faith. With respect to worldview questions number 3 and 6, the personal is what's valuable. So the centrality of relationships kind of it comes to the fore here in theistic existentialism, and this is incredibly helped by a book by Martin Buber named I and Thou, Jewish existentialist theologian, who tries to break down this idea of God as being this complete other thing, and I'm just sort of a subject. He recognized that God as a thou is actually a person with whom I may have relationship. So God, in a lot of versions of traditional theology, is the mysterium tremendum, the unknowable, the other, this kind of grand power in the universe. But for Buber, and I think for a lot of theistic existentialists, God is somebody with whom we can personally commune, who's nearer than my eye. That is, that I can know God more wholly and more helpfully than even I know myself. There's a helpful chart actually at the bottom of 135 in your book, and I hope you take note of this, 135. This chart where it talks about what happens when you have this depersonalized view of God as mysterium tremendum, and this personalized view of God, this God is thou. With respect to sin, in a depersonalized view of God, sin is just breaking a rule. But in a personalized view, it's betraying a relationship. Repentance is just admitting guilt. But in a personalized view of God, there's sorrow over personal betrayal. In a depersonalized world, forgiveness is just canceling a penalty. But in a personalized world, forgiveness is renewing fellowship. Faith is believing a set of propositions in a depersonalized world, but in a personalized world, it's committing oneself to a person. Faith is, I belong to you. In a depersonalized world, the Christian life is just about obeying rules, but in a personalized world, a relationship with God or the Christian life is really about pleasing a person, pleasing the Lord, pleasing somebody that we know. Now, the thing about this is that this chart is great because it's not either or on this chart. It's both and. Sin is breaking the rules, but it's also betraying a person. And forgiveness is that God has canceled our debt, but it's also that we're renewed into fellowship with him. And this is the thing that's kind of a problem, is that Christian theology has always had this both and view of these kinds of things, that we do relate to God as persons, and God is other. God is transcendent and immanent. In some ways, we can't fully know God, and yet God has revealed God's self. And those things are not contradictory. Is that God will never be fully understood by us, and yet we can know him so meaningfully and personally. And so both of these things are true. And they should be seen as true. But theistic existentialism tends to sort of reject the depersonalized world altogether. And says, no, this propositional, simplistic way of looking at religion, this is not quite right. What we have is this personal relationship. And for a robust Christian theist, we should say, no, they're all true. That sin is breaking the rules, but it's also kind of this betrayal of a relationship. And Christian life is not just about doing the right thing. It is about doing the right thing, but it's also about just being with a person. Both of those. All right, worldview question number 6. knowledge is subjectivity. The whole truth is often paradoxical. That is, true knowledge is not about this objective world. Theistic existentialists don't deny the objective world, but the meaningful knowledge that I have about God is my subjectivity. And that subjectivity will often create paradoxes. These relationships with God will often create paradoxes. So for a theistic existentialist, of course, they don't deny facts. Facts are important. But they only become facts that are meaningful if they are facts for me. That is, if I appropriate them subjectively. The objective facts are only meaningful if they are experienced by a self. I think this is great. I mean, this is great. As like the facts are, of course, facts, and they're important, but I need to experience them. I can't just know that Jesus is Lord. I must confess that he is my Lord and become, and take that in and appropriate it subjectively. Of course, humans are made in God's image, yet we're not infinite. Of course, we agree with this. Now, we can have substantial truth, even if we cannot have exhaustive truth. And this is something that's very helpful. And this is Sire's view. Sire's saying we can have both of these things. Worldview question number 7. History as a record of events is uncertain and unimportant, but history as a model or type or myth to be made present and lived is of supreme importance. According to theistic existentialists, the first step is typically that you would distrust the accuracy or the meaning of history, especially religious history. So biblical criticism, this is unimportant. If it rejects the historicity of biblical events, who cares? The second step, then, is to downplay the importance of historical religious truth in favor of spiritualizing the truth. So with respect to things like the fall, fine. They deny this. Theological liberals deny the fall, but what's important about the fall is that it's an existential truth. It's not that Adam and Eve sinned, it's that we all are kind of like Adam and Eve. The resurrection, of course, we know dead men don't rise from the dead, but what's important about the resurrection is that we all can experience new life. This is a problem. This is sort of a denial of the importance of history. Now, there's some important critiques here that Sire offers, and I'll mention these just very briefly in closing. So existentialists start with faulty presuppositions. The first faulty presupposition is that miracles are impossible. Now, the neo-Orthodox theologian Karl Barth, he doesn't deny miracles. He doesn't deny them. But for a lot of people like Bultmann, Brunner, they do deny the miraculous. That's a faulty proposition. Now, also existentialists, including Barth, they say that the Bible's historical record is untrustworthy or unimportant. That's an important critique. I mean, that's a problem. The Bible is the Word of God, and it's God breathed, and something that we should accept as true. Now, our interpretations may not be true, but the Bible itself is. Now, existentialists, they also put too much stock in symbols and not enough stock in truth. And you see this in this quote on the middle of page 142. Page 142. Now, this is a reviewer of Lloyd Geering's Resurrection, A Symbol of Hope. It's an existential Christian work. How can a non-event, that is a resurrection which did not occur, be regarded as a symbol of hope or indeed of anything else? If something has happened, we try to see what it means. If it has not happened, the question cannot arise. We are driven back on the need for an Easter event. So Easter is not just a symbol, because the symbol is only meaningful, that is the symbol of newness of life that's in the Easter message, is only meaningful if a resurrection actually occurred. And so if a resurrection did not actually occur, then that symbol has no meaning. And that's true of all symbols. If you think about the symbol of the stars and stripes, that symbol has meaning because it represents an actual thing. The symbol of you have like a paper money. That's only meaningful because there's government backing that. There's an actual government that enforces the value of that currency. So symbols are meaningless without something actual behind them. And that's an important critique of theistic existentialism. I hope this has been helpful for you. Please let me know if I can help you in any other way this week.